My mom died in 1992. She had pancreatic cancer, and the time from her diagnosis to her death was 21 days.
Wow.
Because her gut was completely involved, she wasn't taking any food by mouth, so she was being fed by vein.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the phrase being used, the cancer eats first.
Mm-hmm.
So like whatever nutrition she was receiving was basically empowering the cancer cells to do their thing.
Yeah.
She made a decision on her own within the week after her exploratory surgery, so probably day 6 or 7 of her diagnosis. She made a decision to stop the nutrition by vein. None of her kids encouraged that. Nobody in the hospital suggested it to her. She made that decision on her own. She was an RN, so I think she kind of understood that that was what was keeping her alive, and it was an artificial means of prolonging her life. And her particular ethic was that just because it had begun, it didn't have to be continued, and she could discontinue it. So the oncologist came in, and she said to him, I was in the room, and I remember her words exactly. She said, "This is what's keeping me alive, isn't it?" And she pointed to the port that was in her neck. And he said, yes. And she said, well, when this bag is empty, let's take this out.
Wow.
And the oncologist said, well, you know, starving to death is not a very pleasant way of dying. And she shot up in her bed, and she wagged her finger at him, and she said, how dare you say that in front of my children?
Wow. Good for her.
She said, I'm in charge of this. Take this out.
Yeah.
And he wrote an order that it should be discontinued, and he never rounded again. He never saw her again for the next 2 weeks.
Wow.
He stopped caring for her.
How do you think she experienced that?
I think she was infuriated.
Yeah.
She understood that her kids would live with this decision that she was making.
Yeah.
And I think she was infuriated that this guy was such a jackass.
Yeah.
And didn't understand that.
Yeah.
And the fact that he never rounded again and never saw us and never saw her is the perfect example to me of how even in our modern advanced medical community, people can be abandoned. Even though they're sitting in a hospital bed, they can be abandoned.
Yeah. Yeah.
So she was being given hydration by vein, but no nutrition. And the morning of the day she died, I was sleeping in the jerry chair in her room. I woke up and she was already awake, and she smiled at me, and she said, do you remember where Mallows is? And Mallows was an Italian bakery in the little town where I grew up. I said, yeah. She goes, take my car and drive over to Mallows, and this was about 5:30 in the morning. She goes, go over there, and she goes, they'll still have apple strudel. Go buy an apple strudel. And she says, I'll get the nurses to bring a pot of coffee so that's here when you get back. And I got in her car, and I drove to the bakery, and I bought an apple strudel, and I brought it back. And sure enough, there was a coffee pot there with 2 coffee cups and a couple plates, and she sliced a little piece of apple strudel and gave it to me, and she sliced a little piece for herself, and we had breakfast together.
Wow.
She hadn't eaten for 3 weeks, and for a moment I realized she was taking care of me. She was feeding me. She was giving me a moment where she was saying, look, I could have been eating all along. This was a decision I made about how my life is going to end because of this cancer. And you and I had that meal together.
Yeah.
And then, you know, that was 6 o'clock in the morning, 6:30 in the morning. And by noon, I think she had gotten really, really sleepy. And by, 2 o'clock, I think she was unconscious. And she died around 10 o'clock that night. And, I was raised Catholic. I have all these Eucharistic images in my head and part of my brain, the way it works. And I'm thinking, she She wanted to break bread with me and share it
Yeah.
with me, and she wanted to feed me
Yeah.
because I was her kid, you know, and I'll never, ever forget that moment.